Settle down, guys. We're about to begin. Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to the New York City Council hearing on the Committee on Civil Service and Labor. At this time, please silence all electronics and do not approach the dais. I repeat, please do not approach the dais. If you are testifying today, make sure you fill out a slip at the back of the room with the Sergeant at Arms. You may submit one online at testimony@council.nyc.gov. That is testimony@council.nyc.gov. Any further questions or concerns, please contact the Sergeant. Chair, you may begin.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Councilmember Carmen De La Rosa, Chair of the Committee on Civil Service and Labor. Thank you for joining us at today's hearing on pending layoffs at the Brooklyn Museum. The Brooklyn Museum is a cornerstone of New York City's cultural landscape, welcoming approximately 650,000 visitors each year and housing over 500,000 artifacts. Its diverse collection spanning from ancient Egyptian antiquities to the works of Norman Rockwell and Georgia O'Keeffe provide an invaluable educational and artistic experience for New Yorkers of all ages. Unfortunately, financial hardships have forced changes to the museum's operation. Earlier this month, the Brooklyn Museum announced a series of cost-saving measures, including a hiring freeze, a reduction in exhibitions, and a cancellation of some weeknight events. Most notably, these budget cuts have resulted in the layoffs of 47 part-time and full-time staff. Shortly thereafter, the New York Times reported that DC 37 Local 1502 sent a cease and desist letter to the museum, citing a contractual requirement for 30-day notice to employees prior to layoffs. The notice period expires in the first week of March, and negotiations remain ongoing. Today, this committee reaffirms our commitment to supporting arts and cultural institutions while also seeking to better understand the circumstances surrounding these layoffs. We will examine the museum's financial management, the role of public funding, the broader implications these cuts may have on employees, visitors, and the cultural sector at large. Our goal is to ensure that institutions like the Brooklyn Museum remain strong, accessible, equitable workplaces while continuing to provide the public with valuable artistic and educational experiences. I'd like to thank the committee staff, Senior Policy Analyst Elizabeth Arts, Legislative Counsel Rie Asawara, external and extern Ravi Rosen from Brooklyn Law School for their hard work in preparing for this hearing. I'd also like to thank my Chief of Staff, James Burke, Deputy Chief of Staff, Kiana Diaz, and Communications Director, Frey Familia, and our legislative fellow, Hiba Ahmad. I would like to recognize that we've been joined by Council Members Moya on Zoom, Councilmember Dinowitz, Menon, and Councilmember Hudson. We will be hearing testimony from representatives from the administration and, we're going to have an opening statement from Councilmember Hudson. We're going to have a opening statement from Councilmember Hudson, and then we'll turn the hearing over to representatives from the administration.
Thank you so much. Good morning, and thank you, Chair De La Rosa, for giving me the opportunity to say a few words about today's oversight topic, pending layoffs at the Brooklyn Museum. I'm proud to represent the 35th District, the cultural capital of Brooklyn, and perhaps even of New York City. My district is home to the Brooklyn Academy of Music, BRIC, the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, the Museum of Contemporary African Diasporan Arts, 651 Arts, and of course the focus of today's hearing, the Brooklyn Museum, which is celebrating its 200th anniversary this year. Arts and culture are an economic engine of our city, with the creative sector accounting for $110 billion in local economic impact and tourism generating $74 billion annually. Yet our city's cultural sector routinely sees tens of millions of dollars in budget cuts each year, which not only impacts the programming of our city's cultural institutions, but also the hardworking staff that keep the lights on, doors open, and exhibitions on display. The Brooklyn Museum's decision to reduce services and end employee agreements is indicative of the harsh fiscal challenges faced by many cultural and arts institutions in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. I've stood shoulder to shoulder with many of my colleagues at rallies and press conferences. I've sat in these very chairs for hearing upon hearing, fighting against the mayor's budget cuts to our cherished cultural institutions. But these institutions are still struggling, and it is our constituents, New Yorkers, who are taking the hits. Whether it's a reduction in educational access for children, less programming for low-income New Yorkers, or the very livelihoods of the 47 employees represented by District Council 37, Local 1502, and UAW Local 2110, it is New Yorkers who are bearing the brunt of these cuts. I stand in solidarity with the workers who keep the museum running and with the cultural institutions throughout the city who year after year fight tooth and nail for the funding they need and deserve. At a time when we're facing an affordability crisis in New York City, we must fight to preserve every good-paying union job in our city. And we must continue advocating for our cultural institutions to not only avoid the budget cuts repeatedly proposed by this administration, but to increase funding that has remained the same since 2015, despite a significant rise in inflation. In order to move forward, the museum must secure the funding it needs to avoid these layoffs in order to protect jobs and preserve our city's rich cultural heritage. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Hudson. We will now be hearing testimony from representatives from the administration. For the first panel, we'll be calling Commissioner Lori Cumbo and Lance Polvey. Sorry, guys, you know my Dominican accent is in style today. And we will turn it over to the committee council to administer the oath for this panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Do you affirm? Hi, folks. Do you affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth before this committee, and to respond honestly to council member questions?
I do.
Commissioner?
I do.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. You may begin.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair De La Rosa and members of the committee. I am Lori Cumbo, Commissioner of the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs. I'm here today to testify regarding today's topic, examining the recently announced layoffs at the Brooklyn Museum. The Brooklyn Museum is one of our city's most important cultural institutions. It's actually one of the largest institutions in the country. And the city and the DCLA provide substantial funding in support of their mission to engage the public with their cultural programming. In fact, the city expense subsidy for the museum has grown from $6.7 million in fiscal year 22 to $8.5 million in the current fiscal year, an increase of 27% over the span of the Adams administration. The city further provides an additional $2 million annually in support for energy costs. But even with this robust support, the vast majority of the museum's funding, more than 80%, comes from other sources. And cultural organizations across the city and beyond are facing major shifts and changes when it comes to their diverse sources of support. Philanthropies are shifting their focus away from the arts. Federal funding has been called into question. Corporations simply aren't giving as much as they once did, and inflation is driving up costs. Audiences have yet to return in the same numbers as they did before the pandemic. Even our tourism numbers, while we've come a long way toward their recovery, still haven't reached their pre-pandemic highs. To dig into one of these major downward trends, according to a report last year in the Art newspaper, private donor contributions have historically accounted for the single largest share of museums' operating revenue. In a survey, while all arts and culture ranks second on older generations' giving priorities, it's not even the top three, unfortunately, for many of our younger donors. Another report found that from 2020 to 2021, while 7 of 9 charitable sectors, such as education and the environment, saw significant growth, giving to the arts, culture, and humanities declined by 8.6%. For these major shifts to come on the heels of the global pandemic has been nothing short of catastrophic for so many organizations. In this environment, cultural institutions are struggling to maintain operations across the city and have been forced to make painful decisions. Layoffs, reductions in programming, and other drastic measures have been taken just to make sure that institutions can stay afloat. The Brooklyn Museum is just the latest example of an organization having to take these dire steps, which no organization wants to do. We have to be clear that this isn't specific to the Brooklyn Museum. Many organizations are facing the same challenges. We are devastated by the job cuts that the museum's budget shortfalls have forced them to pursue. These are cultural workers who have dedicated their time and energy and passion to this critical institution. The same inflationary pressures that are impacting the bottom line of the Brooklyn Museum are also impacting hardworking New Yorkers across the 5 boroughs. The impact to the families of each employee laid off through these cuts will reverberate throughout our communities. I feel for these workers and the unimaginable position each one of them is put in through these cuts. I am a DC 37 baby. Both my parents were DC 37 workers. They worked for off-track betting for most of their career until off-track betting was dissolved. And I remember that time in my household, what that meant for my family, including their medical benefits, which they had to fight for many years until they were restored. You know about that fight, Henry. So I'm here. I totally understand the challenge that so many of you are facing. We want to be of support and assistance and best we can, but also recognizing that this is a huge systemic issue that goes far beyond the Brooklyn Museum, and we need many more players at the table to figure out how to help our DC 37 and UAW and many other workers to maintain their positions moving forward. In the long run, the museum's leadership prioritized the long-term health of their institution. They have a solid plan for putting the museum back on firm financial footing. And like we would do and are doing for any cultural constituent who is struggling, we'll do whatever we can to assist. Culture is part of our city's fabric, and institutions like the Brooklyn Museum are community anchors. They're economic drivers. They're the source of so much of what makes our city great. In 2019, the creative sector had a $110 billion total economic impact and employed 300,000 workers. We are proud of our record-setting investments in culture under the Adams administration. This year's budget is an all-time record high, much larger than even pre-pandemic levels, thanks to our partnership with the City Council. But as I said, local government cannot solve these problems alone. We want to serve as a resource for addressing these broader trends in philanthropy and corporate giving. We need to find the right solutions because our art and culture institutions are the bedrocks of our communities and sources of education, inspiration, and so much more. These institutions helped bring us back from the brink from the pandemic. Now we need to be there for them so that they can support these and so many other critical jobs for New Yorkers in the arts. I want to thank everyone that's come here to testify. I want to thank all of the members of the Brooklyn Museum that are here. I certainly feel your pain and understand the challenges that you're facing with a bit of an uncertain future. Similarly, my second job in my career was at the Brooklyn Museum, so I am a former staffer of the Brooklyn Museum and certainly gave my time and energy to fundraising at the Brooklyn Museum. And so I'm honored to be here to help be a thought partner in coming up with strategic strategies to help and assist not only the Brooklyn Museum, but the broader cultural sector navigate through perhaps what is one of the most unprecedented and challenging times facing our cultural institutions. Thank you so much for all of you, and thank you for being here and calling this hearing.
Thank you, Commissioner. And thank you for your thoughtful words and, your messaging of partnership. That is certainly the goal here. And thank you for taking the time to be here today. I'm gonna ask just 2 questions and then I'm gonna pass on to colleagues and then maybe come back. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the funding. So as of FY25 adopted budget, DCLA and the City Council allocated about $10.1 million in expense funds to the Brooklyn Museum. Each of the 34 members of the Cultural Institutions Group have separate contracts with DCLA outlining the specific use of funding. Can you provide a breakdown of how the Brooklyn Museum allocated the funding for the DCLA funding for FY25 and what portion of that was used for operations, infrastructure, programming, or other specific expenses?
Okay, I just want to start off by giving a special note before I get into the bulk of the question. The 10.574 million includes 75,000 from city council member items and an additional 86,323 in energy subsidy. The city subsidy supports the majority of the DC 37 positions. Currently 153, but will be reduced down to 134 with the pending layoffs. The DC 37 covered positions are chiefly security, maintenance, collections care. The subsidy also covers education and other program staff, not DC 37. Important to note is the city subsidy covers only the base salary of the DC 37 positions, with the museum responsible for the balance of fringe and the contractual premium wage rates, overtime, etc. I just want to add also that our subsidy to the Brooklyn Museum only covers about 20% of the entire operation of the museum. So 20% is typically what government provides support for, but the other 80% comes through foundations, corporations, individual giving, admissions, fundraising, programming, and other programs.
So what percentage would you say directly or indirectly supports the staffing costs?
What is the direct number, the percentage that covers the
The
DC
staffing.
37 staffing out of the subsidy that we give?
Yes, correct.
Essentially all of it.
Okay. 70%, 80%, do you have an idea?
I'll get you the exact number during the
Okay.
course of this hearing, but
Okay.
in the interest of time, if you have another question, we'll come right
Sure.
back to that one.
Are there any restrictions or guidelines within the Brooklyn Museum's contract about how expense funding can be used for staffing?
We don't provide a guideline in the sense of saying this is a rule that the funding has to be spent in this way. What we typically do, we have, we give them an obligation plan, and we work within that obligation plan. And I would say that it's typically used to cover front-facing and essential support staff positions, security, maintenance, as it is typically easier to fundraise for program-related staff and expenses. So I would say that there are not restrictions, but at the top of the fiscal year, SIGs submit a completed obligation plan, which outlines for the year how they intend to allocate their subsidy across organization expenses. The city subsidy is paid out monthly, and SIGs submit a monthly payment request for the upcoming month and a detailed expense report for the previous month. The agency also requires a year-end final report, which includes a previous year of audited financials. So I say that to say that it's more that they submit to us a monthly expense report in terms of how they're spending the money. And then at the end, they have to do a final report, and that final report outlines how they are spending money. And Lance, did you want to add to that?
We also just wanted to add that we currently are providing $80 million in capital support to the Brooklyn Museum for various city-funded capital projects.
Okay. I guess a follow-up, what oversight does DCLA conduct over the Brooklyn Museum's finances, like all of the finances, before approving funding?
That would be the plan that I just outlined, which is the obligation plan.
Okay.
So the obligation plan outlines how they intend to allocate their subsidy across the organization expenses. But what organizations typically do is that they utilize that funding for the positions that are the hardest to fundraise for: security, maintenance, operations. Foundations and corporations typically don't want to fund those types of salaried positions. So many organizations utilize city subsidy for those very specific purposes, and then they would use a portion of their budget for more programmatic expenses where they can fundraise for those. Sometimes those do come under the city subsidy, but very rarely. Because part of it also goes to the fact that for museums such as the Brooklyn Museum, it's very difficult to fundraise for the non-sexy things that we say in the cultural world. But also the challenge becomes on so many levels is that foundations, corporations, individuals, they like to give to a museum or a cultural institution that they feel is very successful, that they have something exciting going on. So this circumstance that the Brooklyn Museum and many other institutions find themselves in is that when they have to do layoffs, when they have to downsize, that's really not the momentum that many organizations want to function from. They want to function from a place of high energy, great programming. So this is a really precarious situation for the museum, and certainly not one that they want to be in, nor do we as an agency want to see this happen.
And did DCLA have any indications that the museum was facing a significant financial shortfall before the layoffs were publicly announced?
We understood that the museum, like many of the cultural institutions, the 34 that we represent as part of the cultural institution groups, they are all experiencing some level of challenge financially that they keep us abreast of. The Brooklyn Museum did not stand out as one of those organizations that were experiencing deficits of this level, but we were aware of it. We were certainly aware of it. We did not know that it was going to come to the point of layoffs and a reduction in programming of this magnitude. I know that they were trying to do a lot of different cost savings measures before it came to this, but this was something that we were aware of, but we didn't know that it was going to take this significant of an impact on the museum staffing.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner. I'm gonna pass it to my colleagues. I have more questions, but I'll pass it to Councilmember Hudson and then Councilmember Menon, and then I'll come back. Okay. Councilmember Menon.
Great. Thank you so much, Chair, and good to see you, Commissioner. So I do have a very specific question. So NYC and Company, which has now been renamed the Visitors and Conventions Bureau, I used to serve on the executive board of NYC and Co. when I was Commissioner of Media and Entertainment. Right now, the City of New York is spending $20 million in budget that they are giving. $20 million of city money is going to NYC and Co. What are you all doing to collaborate with them? Because you say, tourism is down, but you've got a crisis now at the Brooklyn Museum, and it seems to me you could be utilizing some of that funding to do a really targeted campaign to support the Brooklyn Museum. Utilizing, there are 18 different international offices that NYC and Company runs. They also do programs to get New Yorkers to go to different venues. So, if some of that funding was designated for a really robust campaign to boost visitors to the museum, it seems like that would be something that should be tried first.
Well, I think that's what this hearing is all about, solutions, and you're coming up with a good one. We need to further explore that. We could definitely have those conversations. Would love for you to be a part of them so that we can see what we can do to have a more robust tourism program promoting the Brooklyn Museum and other institutions. I'm not sure what they are doing in that sense in terms of how much it's specifically targeted to the Brooklyn Museum. We would have to find that out, but I feel like that's another great solution in terms of maybe more targeted specifically to the museum during this really particularly challenging time could be helpful. I don't know how it's going to help us in the immediate, but I think in the long term, we have to find solutions, and I think that that would be a great one.
Well, I would just suggest respectfully that immediately that this be done, because those funds are there and we've used them in the past for these kinds of, not this particular situation, but other similar situations where you have cultural organizations or venues that are really struggling, and we could do a rapid infusion of funds to help to support that institution. So I would obviously hold off on any draconian measure like layoffs, which we absolutely shouldn't be doing for this institution.
Let me ask you, Councilmember Menon, in that way. You're saying more so for a marketing to increase visitorship at the museum.
correct? Because, I mean, you were saying that tourism is down, that the museum is struggling, that it can't support these additional staff members. But before taking any kind of, I mean, just to be clear, I totally oppose these kinds of layoffs. So before going down that draconian path, why wouldn't we use every tool in our toolbox? We have an amazing tool in our toolbox, which is we have this Visitors and Conventions Bureau. It has significant city funds. Let's hold off on any kind of layoffs and let's try this first and really try to boost the museum and visitorship, which would obviously boost its overall revenues.
We will certainly look into it. Sounds like a wonderful idea. I guess the challenge that I would experience with that is that those funds couldn't be directly allocated to the museum, but it could be utilized, I would suspect, to boost fundraising and tourism and visitorship to the museum without, unfortunately, the museum having direct access to that funding being able to be utilized specifically for staffing.
Correct. The idea is that we come up with an immediate emergency plan to
Fundraising.
support the museum, and this would be one very significant element of it.
Got it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Keep them coming.
Thank you, Councilmember Menon. Commissioner, does your agency require that cultural institutions submit financial contingency plans to prevent worker reductions, given, you know, the landscape that you put forth with all of the SIGs?
DCLA expects all of its constituents to adhere to all applicable laws in this regard. SIGs can choose to hire DC 37 labor and assume the base city negotiated DC 37 salaries, but also have their own negotiated contracts above what the city has negotiated. The city is proud to support institutions that choose to work with strong organized unions and to set a minimum base rate of pay through its own negotiations. The layoffs at the Brooklyn Museum are deeply unfortunate, and we will work with the museum to avoid any additional layoffs.
I get that, but do you all require contingency plan when we're at the point where layoffs are being considered? Is there so, you know, as DCLA is releasing funding to organizations, are you saying if layoffs are something that have been flagged for your agency as something that is forthcoming, is there a contingency plan?
We do not have a contingency plan requirement. We trust with many of the institutions that we support, with the 34 that we support, plus the 1,000 that we support through our CDF program. We administer funds to those organizations, but we do not require contingency plans as part of it.
What about requiring institutions receiving city funding to follow specific labor standards or engage in good faith negotiations with unions before implementing layoffs? Is that something your agency requires?
We require that all groups follow all applicable federal, state, and local law.
Okay. Does DCLA assess the impact of staff reductions on the museum's ability to fulfill its mission?
Ask that one again.
So does your agency basically assess the impact of staff reductions in the ability for the museum to fulfill its mission? So as we're going into this next budget, right? And you're sitting with the museum and you're thinking about the ways the museum should be fulfilling its mission. Are you taking into account the impact of staff reductions?
We don't take into account staff reductions when we are funding the institution. They have a mission statement in terms of programming that they have to administer to the public, and we have to make sure that they are working towards the mission statement that's provided by the institution. So for them to have staffing reductions, which unfortunately happens from time to time with many of our organizations, and the challenge is that we're going to be facing more of those in the upcoming years, is that we have to continue to fund those organizations, and we have to continue to make sure that they can keep the doors open. But at the same time, we don't have a requirement in terms of that they have to fulfill certain amount of staffing obligations before we would fund them in the next budget or fiscal year.
Okay. The museum recently announced the suspension of their First Saturday program, their free flagship event that began in 2023. And from what I hear from the youngsters, it's all the rave.
You got to check it
apparently-
out.
I have to check it out. I have to get myself to Brooklyn a little more frequently. But one of the, it's a free program, and apparently it has brought in a lot of folks to come into the museum. So it's dealing with the issues that I think Councilmember Menon was bringing up in terms of visitorship. Does DCLA have concerns about the impact of these cancellations on public engagement with the museum? And also as a contingency, if it's a free event, why not attach some sort of nominal fee that might help to, because if people know that they want to be there and it's a free program, completely free. If you attach a $20 fee or something like that, while still making it accessible maybe for people who have benefits or other things, you could draw some revenue from a program that is obviously successful. So have those conversations occurred?
I have not had conversation with the museum to go and have a discussion about what if they did it this way or if they did it that way. I trust that they have knowledge about the impact or the financial impact of that program to their bottom line, but as well if they have the staffing in order to be able to maintain and to foster that program. One of the questions, there are a lot of very difficult decisions that all museums and cultural institutions are making across the city. The Brooklyn Museum is one of the few institutions that is preserving and protecting their pay-as-you-wish program. So many organizations or museums have made the decision to say, hey, it's no longer pay as you wish. It's $22 to enter this museum, and that's non-negotiable. The Brooklyn Museum is maintaining their position to say, we want to continue to be a pay-as-you-wish museum. We want to continue to make sure that the First Saturday programs are free and open to the public. These are not permanent cancellations. These are cost-saving measures that they are doing in the immediate in order to be able to foster a plan and a strategic plan to get back on track so that they can have these programs on a year-round basis and that they can be affordable and free to the community. The basis of the First Saturday program was all about accessibility. It's all about making sure that all people can access that particular program. And the benefit of that program, because it's been going on for some time, is that it has inspired museums not only in New York City, but across the country to do these free First Friday or First Saturday programs, and that originated at the Brooklyn Museum. I'm sure there's some thought that if you were to associate a cost with it, you would be changing the dynamics of what makes that program special. So I think that sometimes, and I can't speak completely for them because I'm obviously not on the staff or part of their executive team, I'm sure they're making that decision to say, let's pause for a moment. Let's figure out a new effective economic strategy to take the museum forward. And hopefully in the future, they will be able to bring that, in the very near future, bring that program and many of their other programs back. But there are some organizations that are having these same conversations that we are with that are saying, we're gonna close the gap by raising our prices. And those prices will be non-negotiable. And I'm sure you're aware of many of them in your community as well, that are saying, we have a non-negotiable price, and that's how we're gonna close the gap. That may make it unaffordable for many of your constituents, especially families who are coming with children, that are coming with grandma, that are coming with everyone. They have to make decisions.
Yeah.
So it's a matter of where you wanna make those really tough decisions, but however you make them, it's not gonna be favored by all.
Yeah, I mean, I would still argue that the cancellation, even if it's temporary, still has an impact, right? And I think that if you're seeing something that is wildly successful, even, attaching a cost once a month could lead to some revenue generating options. And I think where I'm coming from, and I think where my colleagues from their questionings are coming from, is that it seems like all options were not exhausted or have not been exhausted before we turn to layoffs, right? And I would also argue that while it is laudable that the museum wants to continue to be accessible, and I firmly support that decision, there are also 57 workers that now have to go home and not provide for their families also. And there's an impact on that, not only in the economy, but also for our city's workforce, right?
That's right.
And so, yes, the hard decisions are being made all the time. And I think that it is our goal to think about how we can support the museum as they go through this hardship, while still thinking about maybe ideas that haven't been brought forth. And again, I don't know, because obviously none of us work at the museum at the moment, but I'm just thinking about ways that we can help them to move that conversation forward. Do the SIGs members have an obligation under agreements with DCLA to maintain a certain level of free programming, or is this something that they're sort of just doing because it's part of their mission?
There is an obligation. It isn't a rule, but there's an obligation, and many of the museums were founded with that and became SIGs under that, such as the Metropolitan Museum. They are a pay-as-you-wish institution, as well as institutions like the American Museum of Natural History. These are pay-as-you-wish programs. But even in their pay-as-you-wish programs, they are negotiating and thinking of other ways in order to continue their pay-as-you-wish program, but maybe limiting some of those programs from it being nationally pay-as-you-wish to the tri-state areas is what we consider our catchment area for pay-as-you-wish, to some are thinking about, no, it's only New York State is pay-as-you-wish. Some are like, it's only New York City as you pay-as-you-wish. So everyone's trying to figure out strategies in order to cut costs, raise revenue, and find new solutions, particularly as foundations, corporations, et cetera, are changing their funding guidelines. Like in my ideal world, this hearing would also have board members, foundations, corporations, individuals, to get everyone in the room to really talk about how are we going to support a cultural sector during one of the toughest challenges in terms of our economy, in terms of the pandemic, in terms of recovery. This is really like a holistic conversation that really needs to be had. And I want to be clear that the city government is not going to be able to financially provide for the over 1,000 organizations that we provide support for. We're not going to be able to make up those deficits from the changes on the federal government to the changes in foundations and corporations. And I understand clearly we do have to continue to find other solutions, but city government is not going to be able to bear the brunt of maintaining and holding up an entire sector that has traditionally had partners in how they function and operate. One of the major ways that the Brooklyn Museum and many other institutions raise money is through fundraising, events, those sorts of programming opportunities provide funding and resources for the Brooklyn Museum on many levels.
I agree with you in that it has to be a holistic conversation. Obviously, we as an agency and council will have the opportunity to bite of that apple at the budget hearings that are starting next month, and we'll be honing in on some of these conversations. And, you know, not only through my committee and through a public hearing that's happening today, but also through the cultural committee, those conversations I know are welcome on our side. But my question was more around, you said that it was a rule but not an obligation. So if they don't maintain the same levels of free programming, their funding is not impacted.
At a certain point, it would be.
It would be.
At a certain point, if an organization, you know, we've operated more so from a policy standpoint. And so if an organization were to start to make decisions to say, we provide no free programming, we provide no accessibility,
Obviously, yeah.
school groups, those sorts of things are going to have to pay general admission costs. Like if it started to operate as a for-profit entity,
Yeah.
then we would have to seriously consider our relationship as a cultural institution group with the City of New York.
Well, Madam Chair, let me give you a good example. So Brooklyn Museum is pay as you wish. If they wanted to increase and say that now everyone has to pay $10 to come to the museum, any increase in your admission fee has to be approved by the city's Department of Cultural Affairs. So that's one tool at our disposal that we can use to have conversations about free and accessible programming, and it's exactly what we do whenever we get an application for an increase is, okay, you want to increase your fee for admission for folks coming to your institution, what are you going to do to make your programming free and accessible to New Yorkers who need it most?
And when there are considerations like the ones we're discussing today, where there's going to be significant layoffs, right? There is wiggle room or flexibility in that conversation because they've gotten to a crisis point at this point.
Well, they haven't come to us with an application to increase their admission fee.
Okay.
Eliminating First Saturdays is devastating for the community, for New York City, for all of those that enjoy it. A good point about First Saturdays, though, is that they used to have a corporate sponsorship. It used to be the name of a corporation, First Saturdays, and that left several years ago. That's a really concrete example and a good way to understand and capture what this change in philanthropic giving from corporations, the impact that it's having on the ground.
That makes sense. Okay. Will these layoffs affect the Brooklyn Museum's ability to access future city funding at all?
It's not going to affect the fact that they are in a difficult financial position right now and that they are experiencing layoffs is not going to cause us to say, we think that your funding should be reduced because you have fewer workers at this time, and you should also have a reduction in your funding. Again, we're only about 20% of the Brooklyn Museum's total operation costs. So we're not going to reduce the museum's funding. We're going to try to figure out ways that we can strategize to be able to have real tangible conversations about how we should help and support during this time.
How would you categorize your involvement as an agency when it comes to exploring measures for city-funded institutions like the SIGs to retain staff during financial downturn? So, as you mentioned, many other organizations are going through this. Does the agency play an official role in trying to have like those planning conversations with the SIGs to say, you know, if staffing is going to be impacted, this is a way that we can help, or help them with the planning of their financial
It's
future?
more when something like this happens, it's more where we would help to strategize in terms of, let's say an organization has an extensive capital project that they've been undertaking for a number of years, and they have seen some challenges internally with reimbursements, and they're paying heavy interest on waiting for those reimbursements to come in. We can try to work to say, let's help you facilitate your paperwork. Let's help you fill out these documents quicker. Let's help to see if on the agency side it's hung up or stuck somewhere or something like that, or maybe you haven't filled out everything you were supposed to fill out. Let's try and do what we can do to get your reimbursement funding into the organization's budget so that they can stop paying heavy interest costs. We also can do things where we can say, have you met with this foundation? Have you met with this corporation? Maybe you all should talk with this organization and see if there's some way that there could be a bridge loan, or if there's some way that you can have funding from a foundation that's interested or willing to help and support at this time. So it's more of a connecting. It's more of, have you thought of this? It's more of that sort of thing. But, you know, as I stated before in this, our increase to the Brooklyn Museum over these last few years has been approximately, in the Adams administration, a 27% increase. So we have supported at the highest level that we possibly could, but the downturn on so many levels, I suspect we're going to be in this meeting room quite a bit discussing a lot of the challenges that our organizations are facing. That's why on so many levels, it's unfortunate that the focus here is specifically the Brooklyn Museum, and this really needs to be a sector conversation in terms of how do we hold up not only our cultural institutions, but the staff that make up these cultural institutions. How do we protect programming? So I hope that we can come back and have a more robust conversation that's not really focused specifically on the Brooklyn Museum, because this issue is so systemic that most of my time as a commissioner is trying to help fulfill and solve for many of these issues so that they can avoid coming to this point. And some who we've read in the headlines have already gotten to that point, and we've tried to help and shepherd those organizations so that they don't have to close their doors.
Yeah, I think we share that goal of preventing this situation, obviously, but when
Yep.
it does happen, the council does have oversight and
Yes.
has the ability to call, for a public hearing. Those are all of my questions. I thank you, colleagues. Any other follow-ups? No? Thank you, Commissioner, for your time and for being here today and being a willing partner in helping us to resolve this. We really appreciate it.
And I want to thank you for calling this hearing in today. I want to thank all of you that are here today. This is a very serious issue. We understand the severity of the issue. We want to work with you moving forward, and I hope that we can do it proactively. I think that we need more internal conversations. We need more phone calls. We need more meetings, because often the ability to sit around a table and to talk through ideas and issues can really help us come up with tangible solutions that'll be long-term. So we now all have each other's numbers, and we can reach out and we can begin a dialogue that will be healthy, not only for us, but for the entire sector. So thank you all so much.
Thank you both. Thank you so much.
And I just want to add, I'll be able to stay for a portion of the hearing, but because we didn't know that far in advance, I do have other meetings that I have to attend today, but I do want to hear as much of the testimony as possible. So thank you.
And as you know, we live stream, so you can put it in and have some Friday night entertainment at home.
That is true. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Commissioner. I now open the floor to public testimony. Before we begin, I remind members of the public that this is a formal government proceeding and that decorum shall be observed at all times. As such, members of the public shall remain silent at all times. The witness table is reserved for people who wish to testify. No video recording or photography is allowed from the witness table. Further, members of the public may not present audio or video recordings as testimony, but may submit transcripts of such recordings to the Sergeant at Arms for inclusion in the hearing record. If you wish to speak at today's hearing, please fill out an appearance card with the Sergeant at Arms and wait for your name to be called. Once you have been recognized, you will have 2 minutes to speak on today's hearing topic regarding pending layoffs at the Brooklyn Museum. If you have written testimony or additional written testimony you wish to submit for the record, please provide a copy of that testimony to the Sergeant at Arms. You may also email written testimony to testimony@council.nyc.gov within 72 hours of this hearing. Audio and video recordings will not be accepted. When you hear your name, please come up to the witness panel. For the first panel, we invite Henry Garrido, Executive Director of DC 37. And that's it. Okay.
All right. Good morning, Madam Chairman. Good morning, members of the committee. Thank you for holding this important hearing. My name is Henry Garrido. I'm the Executive Director, District Council 37, representing 132,000 union members and 100,000 retirees. We are the largest municipal union here. And I come before you to express my absolute alarm and outrage at the layoffs of the members and the workers being proposed at the Brooklyn Museum, which we're facing effective March 9th, just 9 days from now. We're proud to represent our members who do absolutely essential work in running one of New York's city's cultural jewels. Our members execute the members' wonderful public and community programs. They clean and maintain the exhibition space. They curate and install museums' invaluable art and cultural artifacts, and they keep this treasure and the public safe. With salaries as low as $30,000 a year, our members love the work they do because they love the museum, even as they struggle to make ends meet. On Wednesday, February 5th, the Brooklyn Museum informed DC 37 that on February 7th, 2 days later, the museum would announce its massive layoffs. And we learned that at that point that 19 of our members will be giving 30-day notices that would be losing their jobs by March 9th. Together with 21 members of UAW, my sisters and brothers here of Local 2110, and a handful of managers of the museums, the museum made the decision to lay off in total 47 people we demanded to meet. While our union members were being summoned one by one to receive the news from Human Resources, which is inappropriate, down the hall we were pleading with the museum outside council to pause layoff conversation and give us time to determine what was happening and why. The museum council told our staff, right, that the museum had lost more than $11 million in fiscal year 24, and that they were on track to lose another $10 million in fiscal year 25. And they claimed they had no choice but
Please
to
continue.
implement layoffs. To add insult to injury, the museum asked the unions to give up protections that are guaranteed by the union contract that have nothing to do with financial implications. They wanted the union to reduce the time required to do recall. They wanted us to give up and ignore seniority. They wanted us to give all kinds of things that have nothing to do with money, I'll emphasize again. And while union members who worked very tirelessly were facing layoffs even after working for the museum for more than 20 years. We ask why, right? During the physical crisis, why would we want to put the museum and the workers under this condition? And there were other questions I asked. I'm not going to ask, but I will say this to you, to your point, Madam Chairman. I was here in 2016 when the museum was facing layoffs. And I was part of the negotiating team that included then First Deputy Mayor Dean Fullahan, the museum leadership, and many others. And what resulted in that was that the director of the museum, myself, Dean, others, agreed to what you alluded to, which is the voluntary contributions by the folks. There was also, in addition to that, an increased funding by the city and the city council that I was proud of, push for, and this is really important, a furlough that we did for the workers and the managers, that we're able to take unpaid leave for weeks at a time and implement it and sparse throughout the year in order to prevent the layoffs. This was not an easy thing to do, but the workers understood that because we were facing financial difficulties, that we were willing to do everything possible to keep everybody employed. That means even those who were not slated to be laid off took an unpaid furlough to be able to save their fellow co-workers in solidarity, which I thought was amazing. And again, during this process, we approached the museum and said, hey, why don't we do the same? Why don't we start, as painful as it is, to look at alternatives? I think some things were said. I mean, I personally said, you have your museum staff, you hiring people while you are looking to lay off people. This makes no sense to us. You're giving salary raises, so managers, in this case, the director makes more than $1 million. And you're giving raises to people when you're claiming poverty and claiming that you're broke. So there's an inconsistency here where you're blaming the workers for your financial problems, but at the same time, you're unwilling to consider furloughs. You're unwilling to do any kind of revenue-producing pieces. And it's not just the admission piece. There are other museums who did minimum admissions, for instance. Did voluntary admissions, say on these days we're going to have minimum admissions. They would not consider that, right? And we said, why don't we do the furloughs, and that did not happen. In addition to that, I said, I will commit to fight for the museum when it comes to budget season, to the budget cycle that we're about to engage. And they would not consider that. Now, so it begs the question, what is behind all these layoffs? And I will say this to you. I've been the executive director for about 10 years, and at any given time, we face layoffs and institutions lose revenue, and you worked with institutions to come up with solutions to mitigate those layoffs because you have a fundamental understanding that you're not only having somebody lose their job, not have any money to put food on the table, but that there's a financial impact on the city, right? In this case, the Brooklyn Museum does a lot of work at the Department of Education. There are contracts that they do to teach children that is not part of the revenue you heard today. So when you heard from the commissioner, rightfully so, many institutions are facing those challenges. That is a separate part. In the last round in 2016, I remember we even discussed the David Bowie concerts, and they needed a change to raise revenue with the staff of the security because they were making money out of these meetings with David Bowie at the time. And we agreed to make some concessions then that would mitigate the impact on having the guards in terms of premium pay in order to give the museum more flexibility in working. So there are always alternatives. There's a list of things we could be talking about that don't imply people losing their jobs. And we are prepared to do that as long as it shares sacrifices. As long as we don't see managers getting huge increases in salaries when our workers are seeing pink slips. And I'll conclude with this, Madam Chairman, because I feel very strongly about this. One of the questions you raised is how much is the cultural institutions part of our workers? We were told at the bargaining table that it was 50% of the amount. That's what we were told. We were told that their deficits go back to 2015. And so one of the things that I asked was, well, can we look at fringes, for instance? Healthcare is one of the biggest jump that they have had. And I don't blame the museums because I think the commissioner is absolutely right. This is not just a Brooklyn Museum issue. It's endemic of all the museums, and this is just the beginning of much layoffs that we're going to see. Can we look at fringes, for instance? How much does the city charges the museums in terms of fringes for workers, particularly in healthcare? And there's a methodology the city follows based on the administrative code that doesn't make any sense to us because you charge a HIPAA rate for cultural institutions that mostly don't have HIPAA. So there's rooms to do fringe work for all cultural institutions that would allow to reduce the cost of healthcare for the institutions, but it has to be in the context, absolute context, of reducing costs and saving layoffs. It can't just be for management to have more money to spend on trips, I'll say it, to spend on things that have nothing to do with the operation. And I will close with this, Madam Chairwoman. You know, this Brooklyn Museum is fantastic. It has a history, has great exhibits, it provides a great service to the community, provides great service to the children. But what makes the museum shine are its people. It's the workers who make this thing that take less of a salary and sacrifice to make sure they provide the services to that public. Without that, we're just looking at old things on a wall. And people need to remember that. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry, for your testimony, for sharing your experience with us. You know, I continue and will always stand with the workers of our city. And as I said to the commissioner, you know, it has an impact when we lay folks off. And the impact is felt citywide. But it's felt personally for those families that are no longer able to bring home a paycheck, that are no longer able to provide health benefits for their families. I'm going to ask you one question, and then I'm going to pass it to my colleagues because they have questions as well. Can you clarify how the museum's actions violated the union contract?
Well, I said some of it, right? First, by going directly to the workers before they had an opportunity to negotiate, right? So the general practice is you go and you negotiate. You're supposed to meet and confer. That's the term. Not go directly to the workers. That's considered direct dealing. That's violation number one. They also violated by timeline issues, right? We believe, and that would be, I don't want to get into the legal case because we understood that there was a timeline. And this is both questionable in my mind because the budget process ends in June, our budget process in the city. If we have the best possible intention to address the financial problems of the museum, why would you make the layoffs effective March 9th? Why not wait to see what we could have done? Even if the city council did not put up all of the money, even if the administration, and I worked very well with this commissioner, didn't find all the alternatives to do it. If we had a way to reduce that $10 million to say 6, then perhaps you didn't have to lay off 47 people. Perhaps you could reduce that to 20. And then we could have worked to try to figure out to make that from 20 to 0. You see what I'm saying now? So I don't understand the approach of the administration of the museum on this. I know they have a responsibility. And also the other things that bother me is that the things that they were asking by way of concessions to make things better had nothing to do with reducing cost, but reducing the power of the collective bargaining agreements. Seniority has no cost on it, right? And the way that we're doing it, laying off senior people over junior people has no cost other than the fact that you can get rid of whoever you want. So those are the things that we are going to be questioning during this process.
Thank you, Henry. Councilmember Hudson?
Thank you, and thank you so much for your testimony. My first question is, was the director the same in 2016 when you said you had the furloughs and?
Yes. Sorry
okay.
about that. Yes, it was the same director.
Okay, so what is your sense as to why maybe she's not open to similar tactics that were used in the past to save jobs?
Well, honestly, I get along and we talked all the time. When Ann Pasternak, we faced a lot of issues. When the COVID-19 crisis hit, I was leading the fight to get the New York delegation to get federal funding into the museums, even though they weren't classified at the time. If you recall, a lot was said. So there were a lot of conversations there. I think, in all honesty, there was a city hall involvement in those conversations that is not present this time around. So I don't want to put just the museum. It was the first deputy mayor at the time, Dean Fullerhan, who said, from the city's perspective, this is where we are. I heard from the commissioner today. We're going to have conversations about that. But I think the problem is time is of the essence. You need somebody who's going to guide this. And I don't want to put what is happening in the city as a way, but I think that's real.
Yeah.
That if you don't have somebody on that end who can commit to certain things, because what we found as a solution in 2016 was we needed to spread the pain. We didn't bury ourselves and didn't acknowledge the museum was facing financial institutions. But it was a combination of things. It was the institution of the voluntary contributions. It was furloughs. We made a change to other things that were necessary for the museum. And we had a table of things to get to a savings. Some were concessions, quite frankly, in the union. It wasn't just the union workers who took a furlough. Management took a furlough too. And that's what I mean by shared sacrifices.
Right.
But we don't have that this time. And so I hope that between now and before anybody loses their job, that happens.
Absolutely, and I am absolutely willing to work with you and with the museum to make sure that some of those conversations do happen. And then just my only other question was about that specifically. Are those conversations still happening to put potential solutions on the table?
Yeah, we offer furloughs and management rejected those.
Right.
So again, we're going back to the book. It's not something we want to do.
Right.
But a furlough for people, even those who are, I think some of the workers that you'll see here be willing to take, and we can know to pay for and make sure their fellow workers have a job. I've heard from them. I wouldn't be able to do it if they weren't in support of that. So, but management has rejected that, and has rejected that, to be fair, because it's not part of an overall solution. It's only a piece of it. So, but I do think that there are other ideas. To the chairwoman's point, we may have voluntary. So one of the things we did in 2016 is that when the voluntary contribution came into the museum, because it's not like a lot of the museums in Manhattan where you have a lot of tourist traffic, we said, does that exclude children in the area? And we said, no, they're not going to pay. Can we make it such adults pay a minimum amount on certain days? Can we make what we discussed last time was, can we make, say, Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday free, and the other 2 days will be paid? It doesn't have to be an all-in, everybody pays to, we could work around and say, well, that estimates to generate X based on your incoming. And it would allow, communities to access the museum for free on specific days. Because we're facing a crisis, right? We could do that in a way that it could be furlough, that it could be sunset, that we just do it for the next 2 years until we can figure out, and then work on the financial stability of the museum. There are a lot of ideas and things that we can do, but I think the last resort should be laying off people.
Absolutely. I agree with that. I'll be in touch around
Thank you.
continued conversations. Thank you. And thank you, Chair.
Councilmember Menon?
Yes, thank you, Henry, so much for your testimony. I don't have a question. I just want to reiterate support for your testimony and the fact that you've laid out a very clear, creative, outside-of-the-box path, as you did in 2016. There's no reason that the admin shouldn't do it. And in fact, not only is there no reason, the onus is on them to do what needs to be done here. And I think you've laid it out very clearly, and you certainly have my support, and I really urge the admin to listen and to move this forward. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll say, look, we're going to fight this tooth and nail. There is no reason why 47 people should be losing their job until we exhaust everything possible. And we're committing to our union and our brothers and sisters in other unions to fight, because those workers deserve no less. Thank you.
Thank you. I do have a few more questions, but I agree with you. I think that was the messaging that we're all coming across this table and across this room with, is that we're all willing to get in a room and have conversation, right? None of us got here, we're not willing to do that. But it seems to me that all options have not been exhausted. And I think we need to get to the point where we are exhausting every option, and I think you've laid out some very concrete steps that could be taken and could be considered. Have remaining union members raised concerns about increased workloads or job insecurity following the layoffs? How's the morale?
Oh, absolutely. Not only that, about safety. Look, one of the issues that we are facing now, like in the past, is increased concerns about safety in the museum, especially when you have those concerts and events that I mentioned that were not part of it. So now you not only have to cover a door, you have to cover 2 doors. Now you have to clean more spaces that you're not going to be able to do. Now you're going to be able to slow curation of exhibits. So absolutely, right? You often hear the expression, you got to do more with less. This is doing less with less. There's no question about it. But safety is one of the paramount concerns.
That makes a lot of sense. Has the museum shared detailed financial records with the union to justify that the layoffs are unavoidable at this point?
No, they've shown us numbers. They've thrown numbers at us. But as you heard from the commissioner herself, the city's contribution has increased. We know expenses have increased. We know that, we're not blind to the idea that inflation has hit all of us increasingly. But it wasn't like the workers got $1 million in raises. You know what I'm saying? Is if you look at the rate of inflation, what we got was significantly less than the rate of inflation by way of increases. Mm-hmm. So, and somehow the workers always get blamed for this. So no, we haven't. That would be something that we would be using. Hopefully, cooler heads prevail, and we're going to try to work something out. Mm-hmm. But we have not seen any written financial statements that go back. They did said to us that the deficit that they've been facing goes back to 2015. And that every year they've had a mounting deficit until we reached 16, where we were able to balance it for a couple of years through those actions, and then it went back up.
Do you believe, well, obviously you believe that there could be further cuts in the future. What protections are in place to prevent impact on staff?
Well, one of the things I'm going to question is when we did this collective bargaining agreement, we had an understanding there would be no layoffs during that process. Mm-hmm. And that goes to the administration and to the mayor himself. So we're going to be reminding him of that. Now, this is not a city agency, so they would probably take the position that doesn't apply, and that's probably true. But I think there's also a responsibility by city and the city hall to say the Brooklyn Museum is servicing our constituency, right? So they can't get away with saying, well, things are going up in expenses, because I think that's going to happen in other museums. We here in Guggenheim may face this. We went through this with the Brooklyn Academy of Music, to your question, and we worked through that. We had furloughs there. We did some cuts. We were able to figure out. They offer workers a buyout. They were able to bring in new people at a lower wage. There are alternatives to layoffs. And not just to say we're informing you within 30-day notice, this is it. No matter what happens, no matter what the city council does, we're just gonna lay them off. So there are opportunities to work around this.
And what about, I mean, it's been brought up in this hearing a few times about the other SIGs. Are you all,
I'm sorry,
the
can you
other
re-
SIGs, the other cultural institution, the
Yes.
members of the other cultural institution groups?
We've worked out with the others to prevent the idea of layoffs as well.
Okay.
Museum of Natural History, for instance. We worked to minimize the cost of pension, for instance, on CIRS. With the Met, we had a discussion and change the way in bargaining, there are ways you can do it if you approach it from us with the perspective of the union being partners, not somebody you telling what's gonna happen. We need the museum to do the same, and we need the administration to be part of that process.
Great. I want to recognize we've been joined by Councilmember Feliz. If any other colleagues have questions on this? No? Well, we want to thank you.
Thank you.
Henry, for taking the time, and for the workers that are here as well. Sharing your experience is valuable, I think, in bringing us to a solution. And, you know, I reiterate what my colleagues have said here. Layoffs are should be the absolute last resort, and we don't support, you know, New Yorkers losing their jobs here. So thank you for being here and for allowing us to get a glimpse of the challenges that you're also dealing with.
Thank you, and thank you for your support. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next panel, I want to call up June Lee, DC 37, Maida Rosenstein, I'm sorry, with the last names, please correct them for the record, UAW, Ellen Nigro, UAW, Elizabeth St. George, UAW. Yeah? Okay. All right. When you're ready, you may begin. Just identify yourself for the record. And yeah, just make sure the light is red. Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Better.
Let's go. Good morning. First, I wanted to give my thanks to Chair De La Rosa and fellow committee members. Thank you so much for your service, for exemplifying clear and true leadership for the people of New York. It is no small feat, as we know. My name is June Lay. I am a born and raised New Yorker, a part-time CUNY student, and a full-time public programs producer at the Brooklyn Museum. For the past 3 years, I've served as the secretary of DC 37, Local 1502. So I speak to you today as an elected representative of nearly 200 cultural workers in Brooklyn. I started working at the Brooklyn Museum as an intern in 2015, and I've spent a decade believing in the mission of a democratic arts institution that brings culture, learning, joy, and jobs to the borough of Brooklyn. 3 weeks ago, when management abruptly laid off non-union workers and announced a plan to lay off union workers in violation of our contract, myself and my colleagues were shocked and saddened, for the place we love had eschewed its longtime values for a Doge-esque consolidation of power. Last year, the museum told us our financial budget deficit was strategic. Today, it is balancing its budget on the backs of workers who lose their benefits, salaries, pensions, and union membership. I thought our civic institutions were supposed to support democracy and not repress it. As many have noted from the comptroller reports, the creative economy of the city generates $110 billion of economic activity. Despite this, cultural workers are underpaid, our skills exploited and devalued because artwork is seen as a passion project before it is seen as real work. At the Brooklyn Museum, as Henry said, we are already understaffed, with workers clocking in significant overtime during evenings and weekends, risking injury to themselves as well as works of art just to get the shows up on time and make the magic happen. The museum's decision to conduct layoffs when we already function with such a lean staff shows an egregious error in judgment that will have lasting consequences for the future of the museum, its historic collection, and the entire cultural economy of New York City. I just want to point out that no one from museums management is here right now. The museum should be here today to ask for City Council to fund the gap in the budget, but they are not. We are here, and they are the ones who have created the fiscal crisis, not the city and not the workers. The museum is not giving the union precise information, but based off the data that we do have, we believe the museum needs $3 to $4 million to prevent these layoffs. We are asking for management at the museum to completely halt the layoff of our union workers. Further, we asked the Comptroller's Office to conduct an audit to understand how the museum's management led to the point of a $10 million deficit and these layoffs. Lastly, I asked City Council and members of the public to urge the museum to follow our union contract and contribute to furthering democracy, not injuring it. Council members, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Maida Rose. Oops, okay. Does it? Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, good morning, everybody, and thank you so much to the council members for conducting this hearing. My name is Maida Rosenstein. I am the Director of Organizing for Local 2110 of the UAW. We are a technical office and professional union. We represent thousands of members in the cultural sector, both in New York City and New England. Our international union, the United Auto Workers, the UAW, represents over 20,000 members in the New York City area. And I'm very glad to be here representing the 170 member bargaining unit that we just organized at the Brooklyn Museum. I was responsible for that organizing campaign and for leading the negotiations for the first contract. Just want to say that on Friday, this is what has happened. We represent, that unit includes curators, conservators, archivists, graphic designers, exhibition staff, editors, educators, front of house workers in visitor services and retail staff in development and in marketing. We work alongside the members of DC 37 AFSCME. On Friday, February 7th, the museum announced to us with no warning that they planned a mass layoff of staff to be effective on March 10th, claiming that they had a deficit. The overwhelming number of positions that they intend to lay off are union positions. At least 21 Local 2110 represented employees are scheduled for layoff. In addition, and this hasn't been mentioned before, the museum, in addition to the layoffs of the DC 37 and 2110 members, the museum has also told us that they are reducing the hours of a number of our full-time members to part-time and reducing the hours of current part-timers in front of house and education museum educators as well. So it's more than just 47 layoffs. There are other reductions as well. These proposed layoffs and reductions are devastating to our members. Many of the employees that are targeted for layoffs are longer-term, career-based employees. At least one of our members has more than 20 years of service at the museum. How is that justified in any way? Others who you'll hear from are curators and conservators who have years of education and experience that they bring to the museum and that will be lost to the museum. And I will say this is a career killer for some of these folks because it is not easy to come by these jobs. And they could, not only could the Brooklyn Museum lose these people, but the city and state of New York could lose them as well. The layoffs will leave the museum, which was already very skimpily staffed. I represent a lot of other museums, and the Brooklyn does not have a heavy staff amount. It is a small head count. Will leave the museum outright understaffed, and it is going to cause tremendous problems for the people who remain in terms of being able to get the work done, and ultimately will hurt the museum. The layoffs will be devastating to the museum. This is a museum that has a world-class encyclopedic collection that's going to be harmed by the reduction of all of the collection care people that they're getting rid of. Many of the local 2110 people who are scheduled for layoff include those with core positions in collection management, such as curators, conservatives, and exhibition-related staff. As I said, the museum is already understaffed in these areas, and the loss of these skilled professionals will really endanger this collection, which is of value not only to the museum, but to the public. The proposed layoffs are devastating to the city and the community, as others have already testified. The museum is a treasure for the city and for the borough of Brooklyn. The museum is planning to cut 40% of its educational programs and reduce the number of yearly exhibitions. Laying off tax-paying city residents hurts everybody, and cutting the art and culture of New York is indisputably bad for our city, as was said by Councilmember Hudson. This is a revenue generator, and this is just like the spiral down the drain instead of fighting for our economy. So letting one of our major museums flounder should not be an option. The museum has not engaged in good faith bargaining with our union. Instead of coming to us in advance to discuss the deficit and means of reducing it, the museum just announced it as a done deal on February, and as prior people testified, went directly to workers saying you're on the hit list for layoff. That's a direct violation of our contract, which requires them to give us advance notice of any intended reorganizations for the purpose of discussion between the parties. So it's a direct violation, and the union has already filed a grievance over this, as well as charges at the National Labor Relations Board. The museum has not abided by seniority, apparently neither at DC 37 or in our union, and has taken advantage of the fact that, as is typical in this kind of white-collar and professional unit, people are given very highly specialized, unique titles. And so claiming, that seniority is based on these very unique titles, the museum has targeted particular individuals for layoff, which is another whole problem. It's not only that they're laying people off, which is bad enough, but they have used these layoffs in a targeted, they have weaponized this in a targeted way. Our union chairperson has been laid off, a curator at the museum who's been there for years, and who is in the midst of a major deaccessioning project. This makes no sense except in the context of union busting. And a number of people on the list for layoffs are people who have filed grievances or who have testified at a National Labor Relations Board hearing. And so we have filed charges at the National Labor Relations Board against the museum for this anti-union animus. I will say the museum has also told us that they intended they are taking the work and they are going to move it to either non-union management employees at the museum, or also offload it onto consultants, independent contractors, or so-called temporary employees. So make no mistake about it. The museum may have a deficit, but not only have they not talked to the union and bargained in good faith about how to reduce that deficit, they have weaponized it to target and clean house in a way that is...
Can you wrap up? I'm sorry.
Sorry, I will.
Been going over the 2 minutes.
So we have expressed to the museum, as has DC 37, a willingness to work with the museum on the deficit. And we have proposed alternatives such as furloughs, voluntary exit packages to avert the layoffs, but the museum has rejected these things out of hand. And again, I think that underscores the fact that this, layoff has been weaponized. We join with DC 37 in asking the City Council to bridge the funding gap. Museum has told us approximately $3.5 million in savings, for layoffs of DC 37 for union workers. And we join with DC 37 in asking the council and the public to reach out to the director to revisit this. We also join with DC 37 in their call upon, for the controller to audit the museum's finances. And we would say not only should the museum have come to us, the unions, in advance to talk about this, they should have involved the city council in advance as well. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for your testimony.
Hello, is it? Okay. Hello, thank you for having me here today, Madam Chair. My name is Ellen Nigro, and I am the Assistant Paintings Conservator at the Brooklyn Museum. I'm a member of the UAW Local 2110 and a resident of Brooklyn, specifically District 35. I have worked in the museum's conservation department for over 5 years, and the Brooklyn Museum plans to lay me off. As one of 2 paintings conservators at the museum, I'm charged with the preservation and restoration of the museum's painting collection of over 6,000 works. I clean the works of art and repair them if they're damaged, and create policies and enact preventive measures to ensure the physical longevity of the collection. My job, and the jobs of all the conservators at the museum, is critical to ensuring that this 200-year-old institution's collection lasts for 200 more years. The conservation department itself is over 90 years old, one of the oldest institutional labs in the city, and I am proud to be in the long line of conservators who care for this precious resource. Conservators are a key part of an ecosystem of core museum workers that directly care for the art. We collaborate with curators, registrars, art handlers, exhibition designers, and collections managers to ensure the artworks are stored, exhibited, loaned, documented, and moved as safely as possible. The conservators have highly specialized knowledge in art materials, chemistry, and art history. We also have the fine craft skills to execute detailed treatments on priceless artworks. This knowledge and skill is acquired through years of formal education and hands-on training. For example, in my case, I have a Bachelor of Arts in Art Conservation and Art History, and a 3-year Master's of Science in Art Conservation with a specialization in paintings. My advanced hands-on training was completed during a Fulbright year in the Netherlands, a postmaster's fellowship at the University of Cambridge in the UK, and a fellowship at the Brooklyn Museum. The museum cannot afford to cut its core museum workers whose expertise, institutional knowledge, and established rapport allows the collection to be cared for and exhibited in the most efficient and effective manner. I am building my career here, starting first as the fellow in 2019, and then moving into the assistant conservator role in 2021, where I hoped to grow my career well beyond March of 2025. My skills and knowledge, and that of my colleagues, are a precious and growing resource that would be lost in layoffs. I choose to work for the Brooklyn Museum because of its commitment to being a community resource and a space for all. I take pride in the fact that I get to serve the community in which I live. But what I do not take pride in is management's poor decision-making, lip service to its workers, and blatant disregard for 2 union contracts. Management's choice to lay me and my colleagues off is in direct opposition to its commitment to its community. Not only would it be harder for the museum to make its art accessible with fewer workers, the layoffs would also strip away the livelihoods of people in the very community that they supposedly are committed to. And for all of these reasons, I am here today to call on City Council to insist the Brooklyn Museum immediately halt the layoffs and to bargain with the UAW and DC 37 in good faith. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you for this opportunity to appear before this committee. My name is Elizabeth St. George. I am a resident. Can you hear me now? Okay, good. Gonna do this. Still good? Okay. My name is Elizabeth St. George. I am a resident of Sunset Park, Brooklyn, and serve as unit chair of the Brooklyn Museum's Local 2110 UAW shop, representing 170 members. I have worked at the Brooklyn Museum as assistant curator of decorative arts and design since January 2020. However, my position is now selected for termination. As a curator at the museum, I oversee 30,000 objects, research and public scholarship about the collection, conceive, coordinate, and install temporary exhibitions and permanent displays. The training for this type of job is extensive, requiring advanced degrees, multiple advanced degrees, and a multitude of work experience. This is vital work that not only supports the physical care and safety of artwork, but makes historical research and knowledge broadly available through our website and gallery didactics. Also through tours and other teaching opportunities, I guide visitors and school groups of all ages through the museum and share stories about objects, the collection, and Brooklyn history that serve as a significant source of public education for our community. This aspect of public service, educating and building relationships with visitors, is probably the part of the job that I love the most. With its cost and staff reductions, including my position and others, the museum plans to cut 40% of its education public programs, reducing its ability to serve and educate and engage with the local community of all ages. With 22 years of experience in the museum field, I wanted to work at the Brooklyn Museum because of its mission that proclaims, quote, to bring people together through art and experiences that inspire celebration, compassion, courage, and the will to act. To be the place where art is a powerful force for personal transformation and social change, end quote. In recent weeks, I have been outraged that this institution for social change has rejected humane labor values and rights, not honoring its contracts with its labor unions, and creating an environment of disastrously low morale. Indeed, the museum has not shown compassion nor courage. Its staff have been left wondering how good faith in the museum's mission can be restored or achieved by eliminating nearly 50 essential positions. Local community members I have spoke to who rely on the museum's facilities and programs are equally concerned about these staff reductions, particularly how this will affect access to the museum's world-renowned collections and its role as a public forum and space. Today, along with my fellow colleagues from the Brooklyn Museum and UAW and DC 37, I request that the City Council bridge the funding gap, about $3.5 to $4 million, to stop the layoffs at the Brooklyn Museum and to please contact the director and Pasternak to halt these layoffs entirely. I ask that the controller audit the museum's finances to understand how this deficit came about. Thank you.
Thank you all for testifying. I'm really appreciative of you all coming here. It takes courage to do what you're doing. It takes courage to speak up and stand up and be vulnerable. So I want to acknowledge that. And I think that the experience that you're going through right now, it's important for people to hear it and to know that it is happening. And I'm sorry that you all are going through this. I can't imagine what it feels like to have the instability that you all are all feeling right now, especially as you speak about your hopes for the future of your careers, which obviously took a lot of schooling and a lot of sacrifices to get to where you are. And I want to thank you for also highlighting, the workers that have experienced targeting through this process as well. And so I don't have any questions. I just wanted to thank you all for coming. Your testimony will obviously be put into the record, and we'll follow up. This will be an ongoing conversation, but I really did want to take the opportunity to thank UAW DC 37 for your ongoing solidarity and courage in this process. Thank you. Thank you for coming. We have one more panel that is on Zoom, and hold on one second. Yep. Okay, so our on Zoom panel. Okay, sorry. Thank you all. Thank you to all who came here for sharing your thoughts and experiences today. If anyone in the chamber who wishes to speak but has not yet had the opportunity to do so, please raise your hand and fill out an appearance card with the Sergeant at Arms at the back of the room. Seeing no hands in the chamber, we will now shift to Zoom testimony. When your name is called, please wait until a member of our team unmutes you and the sergeant at arms indicates that you may begin. We will start with Brandon Mansilla, followed by Vale Konert Yont. I'm messing up these names. Please make sure that you correct them for the record.
You may begin.
Brandon, you may begin.
Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Brandon Mancia, the director of UAW Region 9A, which includes Local 2110 under its umbrella. I'm here on behalf of the 1 million active and retired members of the UAW across the country and 20,000 members in New York City. And here to support our UAW Local 2110 members at the Brooklyn Museum. I want to echo what Ameda Rosenstein and the members have already said about the UAW's commitment to fighting for these members at Brooklyn Museum facing these unjust layoffs. And I also want to express my support to the members represented by DC 37 and Brother Garrido in this fight. DC 37 and the UAW will be united in this fight as we relentlessly represent and win justice for our members. I want to just say that in the era of DOJ and the federal threats to all of our institutions, it is our duty as a union to speak against all attempts to normalize layoffs and downsizing. And we believe it is the city's responsibility, city government's responsibility, to do everything in its power to make the city affordable and a home of good, union-respecting employers. The city cannot be a beacon of hope and an alternative to what's going on in Washington if we allow our storied institutions to not honor its commitments to the community, to art, and to its workers that make these institutions run. We have talked to state electeds and we will continue to do so to emphasize the need to invest and increase funding for cultural institutions and museums across the city and state. And we also call on the city council to support our calls to make these situations unacceptable and end these practices that only go to hurt our members and union bust our unions. It is unacceptable and it is ridiculous that the museum leadership isn't here to explain themselves. We believe in the spirit of collective bargaining, and as an institution that receives state and city funding, that they should be here to be accountable to the
Your time has
decisions that they
expired.
make.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Brandon. Up next, we have Vale.
You may begin.
Hi, yes. My name is Vale Konert-Yant, and I'm the Assistant Director of Region 9A of the UAW, covering New York City. The A in UAW, of course, stands for auto, but in New York City, it could also stand for the arts because UAW Local 2110 represents thousands of workers at museums and cultural institutions in the city, including 170 staff at the Brooklyn Museum, some of whom you just heard from. On Tuesday night, hundreds of union workers and community members showed up to protest the recent layoffs impacting nearly 50 full and part-time staff members who are members of UAW Local 2110 and DC 37. And it was incredible to see so many of the people at this hearing there in person on Tuesday. It's absolutely unacceptable for the museum to lay off these workers. It's especially outrageous that for management, who have not only failed to plan for, but also contributed to the budgetary shortfall, to do so when they haven't exhausted every other option or even bothered to bargain in good faith with our union. And starting by slashing workers essential to maintaining the collections, who make less than 6% of what the executive director makes, shows just how deeply ill-considered and wrong this decision is. It's bad for the staff and bad for the institution and bad for its collections. And if there's one thing you should know about the UAW, it's that our members will always fight and fight hard for our jobs. We have a saying in the UAW by former President Walter Reuther, who said there's a direct relationship between the ballot box and the bread box, and what the union fights for and wins at the bargaining table can be taken away in the legislative halls. We at the UAW know this very well, and it's never been more relevant than today. We just cannot normalize layoffs and the decimation of our public services and institutions like this, not in Brooklyn and not anywhere else. So we really need our elected officials to stand up and use your power to save these workers' jobs and not let union members be targeted for sacrifice. And we will remember those who stood up for our members when we go to the ballot box. Thank you to everyone who's participated in this hearing. And I appreciate the opportunity to speak on behalf of our membership. Thank you.
Thank you, Vale. We are making a final call for Zoom registrants who have not yet spoken. If you're currently on Zoom and wish to speak, but have not yet had the opportunity to do so, please use the raise hand function and our staff will unmute you. Seeing no hands, I would like to note that everyone can submit written testimony to testimony@council.nyc.gov within 72 hours of this hearing. To conclude, I would like to thank all of the folks who provide the rich cultural experience that New York is known for. To all of those who attended today's hearing to share your experiences. I think we've had a productive conversation here where we were able to delve into some of the experiences of the workers here, some of the challenges coming from our cultural institutions, from our city agencies. And we hope that you all have enjoyed being here and witnessing government in action. We look forward to continuing to have this conversation. This is not the end of the conversation. This is just a point in the conversation. And with that, we'll now conclude the hearing. Thank you. We're adjourned. Thank you.